Hi St. Mark's. This is the third video in a series I'm doing on English hymns. The past couple of weeks I focused on metrical psalm texts, which were the basis of English hymns for a very long time. And this week I'd like to turn from the psalm texts to the hymn tunes, specifically from the Reformation to 1750. The first accounts of congregational singing in England occur pretty late in the Reformation period. The Reformation in England began in 1534 when King Henry VIII famously declared himself as the head of the Church of England rather than the Pope. It's not until after the death of King Henry VIII that congregational singing first appears in England, and the earliest records we have are from 1559. During his rule, King Henry VIII did allow Miles Coverdale to publish his ghostly psalms and spiritual songs in 1535. This was a collection of English translations of German hymns, but although Henry VIII allowed these to be published and disseminated, they were never used in church. And when his political advantage that he thought he would gain with Lutheran principalities, when that political power went away, he gathered these collections up and burned them. In 1549, the Act of Uniformity declared that in the country of England, the Book of Common Prayer was to be used for church services. The first Book of Common Prayer makes no mention of singing whatsoever. I've mentioned in previous videos that English refugees who were seeking religious freedoms made their way to the continent and settled in areas like Geneva, Switzerland, or Frankfurt, Germany, or Amsterdam in the Netherlands. However, earlier in the Reformation period, refugees from the continent made their way to England to seek religious freedom. French and Dutch refugees settled in London and were allowed to worship in their own way at the Church of Austin Friars in London. And they brought with them this metrical psalmody from the continent. This may have been the first congregational singing done in England. During the reign of Queen Mary I, who was Roman Catholic, these French and Dutch refugees went back to their own countries. They were fleeing the same reason. And they took with them English refugees who were fleeing this Roman Catholic queen. In 1554, the settlement in Frankfurt records the introduction of congregational singing at the end of daily services. The account records that this was already happening in French, Dutch, Italian, Spanish, and Scottish churches. Scottish Puritan John Knox led the English-speaking church in Geneva. Englishman William Whittingham succeeded Knox and published a collection of congregational psalms or hymn tunes in 1556, which, after several revisions and additions, culminated in the whole book of Psalms collected into English meter by T. Sternhold in 1562, the so-called Old Version. Between 1556 and 1564, these collections grew to 142 different hymn tunes from various origins. 35 of them were from the French Psalter, 9 were from German sources, 98 were original British tunes, and these tunes may reflect a type of a secular song, but none of them has been linked to a particular folk song. Most of these early British psalm tunes were 8 lines long and were in common meter double, or 8-6, 8-6, 8-6, 8-6. There's one unusual meter of note from this time period. It was created by English Puritan John Pullein for Psalm 148, and it's in the meter 6-6, 6-6, 4-4, 4-4. This meter was also used for John Craig for his setting of Psalm 136. Tate and Brady, which is the new version of the Psalter I spoke of last week, they carried on these meters for these two psalms in their version of the Psalter. An example of a hymn that's in this meter is hymn number 625. It's called Darwall's 148th, which refers to its association with Psalm 148. The hymnal 1982 also includes two hymns from French sources from this time period. One is hymn 404, which is called Old 124th. Another French tune from this time period is the ever-famous Old 100th. Which I believe is one of the top 5 English hymns in the world. And two German hymn tunes from this time period include Old 113th, which is hymn 429. Another German hymn tune from this time period is hymn number 575. Now, if you look at the bottom of the page, it lists the German title, Vater unser im Himmelreich, which is Our Father in Heaven. And it's Martin Luther's text for the Lord's Prayer. But it's also known as Old 112th when it's associated with psalm tones. So I've just played examples of French tunes and German tunes from this time period. However, it's interesting to note that none of the English tunes from this time period occur in their original versions. I've just shared a few tunes from French and German sources, but it's very interesting to note that our modern Episcopal hymnal doesn't contain any, 0, tunes of British origin from this time period. No one is exactly sure why, but they just really haven't stood up to the test of time. We do have some fragments and some alterations in the hymnal, though. Hymn 332 is an example. It's called St. Flavian, and it's the first half of the tune associated with Psalm 132. We may know the other rhythm, which we sing during Lent, that goes like this. It's also interesting that in the hymnal 1982, we have two very different hymns that are derived from the original tune for Psalm 81. The first is hymn 259, which is called Old 120th. And perhaps even more famously, hymn 94, which is called Winchester Old. Which you may remember from the hymn quiz videos. Congregational singing in England was originally a cappella, or without accompaniment. A cappella, after all, means in the style of the church. Tempos may have started out quickly and sprightly, but very quickly they slowed down, almost to a dirge. And they were so sluggish that they became known as the old or common way of singing. In 1567, Archbishop of Canterbury Matthew Parker published a collection called The Whole Psalter, translated into English meter. As the Archbishop of Canterbury, he had funding, and he was able to hire the best musicians in the land to write tunes for his collection. Unlike those poor refugees on the continent who had to make do with whoever was around, he could afford the very best. And the very best at that time was Thomas Tallis. We have 3 of Thomas Tallis's hymn tunes in the hymnal 1982. The first is hymn number 25. It's called the 8th tune, and choir camp choristers know this one very well because we sang it every night at evensong as the Phos Hilaron. That tune is also known as the Tallis Canon because it can be sung as a canon or as a round at a distance of 1 measure. The second tune of Thomas Tallis in our hymnal is hymn number 692, called the 3rd tune. The 3rd tune, written by Thomas Tallis in the hymnal 1982, is hymn 489, called Tallis's Ordinal. Now, as an interesting aside, last week I mentioned the Episcopal priest F. Bland Tucker, who wrote texts for the hymnal 1982. He's a 20th century priest. He's from Georgia, and all 3 texts for those hymns I just played were written by him. So it's interesting that we have a 20th century hymn text paired with a 16th century tunes. In 1592, Thomas East published his collection, The Whole Book of Psalms, with their wonted tunes, as they are sung in the churches, composed into 4 parts. This collection was revolutionary. It was revolutionary because it contained not only texts for all of the psalms, but also tunes for every psalm. Previous collections would often use the same tune for multiple psalms, and publishers would include a little note that said something like, "Sing this as the 18th psalm." All the tunes in East's collection are also harmonized in 4 voices, though there is no evidence whatsoever that this book was ever used in church. But its use of 4-voice harmonizations made it a landmark in English congregational song. In the first edition of East's collection, he included different tunes for every psalm. In the second edition, he reduced this down to only 4 tunes. And he says that the psalms are sung to these 4 tunes in most churches of this realm. And he set all of the psalms to these 4 tunes. And he did this to reflect what was already happening in Scotland and Wales. Scotland had what they called the 12 common tunes. Wales had a different collections called, I'll put it down below because it's Welsh and I can't pronounce it, which contained 12 tunes as well. East's 1592 book, the first edition, was also revolutionary in another way. It began the Anglo-Saxon tradition of naming tunes rather than simply using the first line of a text. A perfect example is the hymn I played a few minutes ago, Vater unser im Himmelreich. That's the first line of the German text. However, in English, it's known as Old 112th. East's practice of uniquely naming a tune allows you to identify these common tunes that are meant to be sung with multiple texts. An example of one of these tunes is hymn 581, which is the only example of East's tunes in the hymnal 1982. It's called Cheshire. Thomas Ravenscroft was also a pioneer in this realm of giving tunes unique names to help identify them. In his collection called Whole Book of Psalms, composed into 4 parts by sundry authors, was the first to associate English and Welsh cathedrals and choral foundation names to tunes. One example is hymn 642 called Windsor. A second example is hymn 94 that I've already played for you. It was originally called Winchester. Later on, a second tune called Winchester came along, and so this tune became known as Winchester Old, and the other tune became known as Winchester New. In Scotland, hymn tunes tended to be named for places. So for example, hymn 121 is known as Caithness. There's also hymn 126 called Dundee. To this day, hymn tunes are most often named for a city, or a village, or a church, or an institution. Orlando Gibbons was a very, very talented composer from this time period. He was also the organist at Westminster Abbey. He wrote 16 tunes for George Wither's Hymns and Songs of the Church, published in 1623. Originally, these tunes were written in only 2 vocal parts. 6 of Gibbons' tunes are included in the hymnal 1982. One is hymn number 499, and the text associated with this tune is a setting of the Nunc Dimittis, sung at evensong. Another of Gibbons' tunes is hymn number 264, which is called Song 34. And a third example is hymn 328, known as Song 46. In the latter part of the 17th century, hymn singing fell into a bit of a decline. But in the reign of Queen Anne, which was from 1702 to 1714, there was a renewed interest in high church practices. And this high church movement in England ushered in a new desire to raise standards of singing in church. Urban parishes utilized the organ, and choirs made up of charity children. Town and country churches formed religious societies teaching children to read music. New and more poetic texts were written, and they were accompanied by new tunes, especially by composers such as Jeremiah Clarke, who wrote the famous Trumpet Voluntary used at weddings. And William Croft, who wrote one of the most famous church tunes in English. It's hymn number 680, which you've heard me talk about a lot. And there are several anonymous tunes from this period. For example, hymn 483 with the tune called Saint Magnus. There's also hymn 576 called Saint Matthew. And perhaps the most famous one, sung almost universally on Easter morning, hymn 207, Easter Hymn. The next generation included composers such as George Frederick Handel, William Boyce, William Hayes, Felice de Giardini, and John Wainwright. An example of one of William Boyce's tunes is hymn number 706, Halton Holgate. An example of a tune by Felice de Giardini is hymn number 365, Moscow. And one of the most famous tunes from this period is ironically called America, which, as Anne from the choir would quickly point out, you mean God Save the Queen. In the century between 1570 and 1670, organs virtually disappeared from the churches in England. In the early 18th century, there seemed to be a renewed interest in bringing the organ back to church, and they were used to accompany the children's choirs who sang in church at this time period. Country churches couldn't afford them. They were still largely without organs, and singing was accompanied by a bass viol, or a sort of Baroque cello in a way, or a bassoon, or after 1750, perhaps by a small instrumental ensemble. In the country style of singing, the tenor voice, or the highest men's voice, which is what I happen to sing, had the melody, and it was usually in 3 or 4 voice settings. Examples of these country hymn tunes include hymn number 164 called Bangor. Another example of a country hymn tune is hymn 411, St. Thomas Williams. And one last of these country tunes that survives in our hymnal today is hymn number 137, Wareham. Now, all of these country hymns have beautiful melodies, But the musicians serving these rural areas were not formally trained. They didn't have extensive conservatory educations. And so the harmonizations of these melodies were from later generations. I mentioned the act of uniformity and the idea that all of the Church of England would follow the Book of Common Prayer and be of one mind. Well, that didn't work out so well, and there were splinter groups known as dissenting churches or nonconformists. They were known as the Independents, who were later called Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists. And each one of these dissenting factions created their own set of hymns. One of my absolute favorite hymns of all time, I think it may be number 1, is hymn number 57. And it comes out of the Methodist movement from this time period. The tune is called Helmsley. It's an Advent hymn. And this Methodist type of tune is a new type of hymn tune. It borrows freely from secular forms that were popular at the time. And it would take the Church of England 100 years to adapt this style of hymn. Here's my favorite hymn, hymn 57. I'm playing the whole thing. Sorry, you have to bear with me. One of my greatest memories was my trip to England last year, and I happened to be at St. Paul's Cathedral for Lessons and Carols on the first Sunday of Advent 2019. And I sang this hymn from memory with tears streaming down my cheeks. It's just one of my absolute favorites. So I mentioned Congregationalists and Presbyterians and Methodists, and they were dissenting churches. Another dissenting church are Roman Catholics in England at this time period. And they went into exile. Many of them went to France. And we have 2 tunes in our hymnal that come from this group of people. First is actually hymn 58, which is just over the page from Helmsley that I just played. This is set with the same text here, and it has a different flavor, and it can give a different perspective on the hymn tune. And perhaps the most famous hymn tune from this time period, written by English Roman Catholics in exile on the continent, is hymn number 83, sung almost universally at midnight mass, including here at St. Mark's. The hymn tune is Adeste Fidelis, and the text is, O come all ye faithful. And with that, we've gone from the beginning of the Reformation with Henry VIII to 1750, talking about hymn tunes in England. I have spent so much time playing hymns and organ pieces based on hymns lately. I thought perhaps I would end this week's video with a piece by Jeremiah Clarke that is famously played at many weddings. I hope you enjoy it, and especially if it was played at your wedding. I hope you've enjoyed this 3rd installment in this video series, and we hope to see you very soon.
Uh-oh, you're evaluating my work.
I am.
Are you subscribed?
I will with the red button.
And give us a thumbs up.
I'm a fan, of course.